So, you have seen that is the how the behavior modeling that is affecting the learning process of the trainees, and therefore, it is very much important that is we incorporate the trainees as much as possible. We give them the situation, ask them to demonstrate that particular behavior, and normally this behavior, as I mentioned in the earlier module, that this behavior is required to be very positive, and then that positive behavior will be giving a right message, that is yes, you are also supposed to behave in this particular manner. And this can be for the any role of a superior, role of a subordinate, role of a colleague, or any other role which is suitable for that particular employee within that organization. Then that is supposed to be the demonstrated by the all these actors or the characters which are the part of this particular process. Now, here when we are talking about the displayed key behavior in the role play, so it becomes very important, that is the what exactly we want to demonstrate. So, first and foremost is the creativity. The creativity, that is everything is not explained in behavior modeling. Let them also get certain stimulus, and then they show and demonstrate certain input by their own. So, sometimes it can be just like a part of sense of humor also. So, that can be also there, a body language also, that can be also there, or sometimes a particular dialogue, that can be also there. So, therefore, the solutions to the problems and behavior in a particular behavior, what will be the response of the another person, another character, that can be the part of this creativity. Next is the persuasion. The behavior modeling should demonstrate the persuasion, because persuasion is making the key of success, and more we are having the persuasion, then definitely these characters when they talk about that is the if you pursue, then we can get the better results in the organization. Characters will be able to play better and more. So, more realistic way. So, therefore, in that case this persuasion is becoming a very important part in the case of the demonstration. Next is the collaboration. The collaboration talks about, that is the there are so many characters and every character is dependent on others. So, what is the interaction is there amongst these particular characters, that we have to see, and then is there synergy, because when we talk about the managerial functions, so one is the coordination and the collaboration. So, that collaboration is existing or not. If the collaboration is not existing, then that will be a big issue. So, whenever we talk about the creativity and persuasion, simultaneously we have to ensure this coordination amongst these particular are the characters, and there is a collaboration, then definitely the overall effectiveness that will be high. So, please be careful, that is in the behavior modeling, whenever we are talking about the different behaviors, the one very important factor, that is a collaboration, that has to be there whenever we are talking about this type of the exercise or using this tool for giving the training. Next part is, that is the adaptability. So, adaptability is very important, that earlier also I mentioned, that is whenever we talk about managerial effectiveness, there has to be productivity, flexibility and adaptability. And if the employee is adaptable, he is adaptable to the culture, he is adaptable to a particular situation, he is adaptable to a particular change, then definitely organization will develop. So, to develop an organization, it becomes very important, that is there is the adaptability, and in behavior modeling we have to keep some rooms for these particular adaptability features. So, when we are having these adaptability features, and then in behavior it has to be reflected, that is yes, there was adaptability, that is why the company could face the competition, employees could survive, and better change has brought into the overall organization. The next part is that is a time management, that is how to manage the time. So, whenever we are talking about the behavior modeling, it becomes a message to the training, rest of the trainees, that is the trainer is also concerned with the time management and he is focusing on that is the how one can ensure the time. So, therefore, whenever we are talking about the creativity, and then this creativity has to be displayed so that new ideas are welcome. We are talking about the persuasion, which is helping in the interpersonal relationship, and the collaboration for the team building. So, team effectiveness, that will be depending upon the collaboration. Lot of research has shown that one should be able to differentiate between the group and team. And whenever we talk about the group, so group means that is the individual who is not having any concern with the rest of the members in that particular department or section. So, keep that particular collaboration, it is important, that is the we are having the team effectiveness only when we are having the emotional connect also. Please understand that is these managerial principles, if there is no persuasion, if there is no proper the adaptability, then definitely in that case this collaboration will not be there, and then there will be no success in getting the behavior from the others in that particular organization. The flexibility, productivity and adaptability. So, this adaptability is only possible when there is a flexibility. If there is a lack of flexibility, there will be lack of adaptability, because for adaptability flexibility is very essential, and then in that case the employees, they will not be able to demonstrate the behavior as they are adaptable and they are agree to many problems and supportive to solve the problems of the employees. Then there is a time management. Whenever we are talking about the time management, that is the management of minutes, and this management of minutes is becoming a very important resource nowadays. So, unless and until if somebody is not able to manage the minutes, that is the time, then he will not be successful. So, in behavior modeling, that particular aspect of the time behaving is also required, so that the person can demonstrate these particular time management practices. All these practices, as we are talking about, we can keep in the sessions of training and in the appropriate under the appropriate umbrella, like maybe the managerial effectiveness, there can be the individual effectiveness, their organizational effectiveness is there, and then these in these type of the aims and goals, we can have these sessions as a part of the key behavior in the organization. Now, whenever we are talking about the behavior modeling, the first and foremost is that if a person is not ready to listen, he cannot demonstrate acceptance basically. So, I would like to say that when we talk about the learn to listen, it is nothing but the acceptance. A person is having the acceptance to others, and in behavior modeling we have to show that is the our leader, our team leader, our group leader, our organizational manager, that he is ready to learn to listen, and that is the acceptance to other ideas of others. Some people, because of their past experiences, they are not able to make the acceptance, and then in that case they are not ready to listen. But if they are not ready to listen, then there cannot be the team effectiveness, there cannot be the collective wisdom, and therefore, for the collective vision it is required that there should be the acceptance is required. Now, in behavior modeling, you have to show a behavior like a positive character or a negative character, but you can choose your words. So, not necessary to copy the scripts, not necessary, that is you select a case study get the particular character and ask the person, that is during this particular behavior modeling of type of training where we show this behavior replication and then the trainees learn, and then you have to choose your you cannot choose your words, you have to use these words only. No, that is not correct. What is important is they can choose their words. So, in this earlier video you must have seen that module, that is the when the students were talking about a particular aspect, they were making the use of their own words and not necessarily the words of the others. Now, here another important point is behavior modeling is, that is the we have to understand the communication of each other. If we do not understand the communication of each other, the task cannot be accomplished. So, therefore, to accomplish the task, understand why communication fails, why which barriers of the communication they are playing a dominant role, and as a result of which the communication is not complete. This may be a reason of the ego, this may be a reason of fear, this may be a reason of the even itself is the citizenship behavior. So, therefore, in that case we have to understand why communication fails. Then we have to remember the importance of non-verbal communication. Employees are involved or not, that commitment is there or not, ownership is there or not, belongingness is there or not, this we can judge on the basis of their presence or absence. And also even if they are present, whether they are involved or they are not involved. Suppose if the employee is not available, right. So, then in that case it might be the reason that he is not willing, and this type of the non-verbal communication that is to be noticed. So, non-verbal communication, what it talks about? Non-verbal communication talks about, that is they are not able to match with each other, they are not able to learn from each other, and therefore, in that case in the especially the group activity, in the group activity we have to see the verbal communication and the non-verbal communication. And if the non-verbal communication is negative, we have to be very careful, because the person may show the verbal communication and maybe the acceptance because of their own affection to the organization. But if the persons or employees are not showing the any non-verbal communication, it means that they are not involved. So, there might be the lack of job satisfaction, and if it is so, it is a serious indicator of the behavior modeling. Another is that is the be positive. So, if you want to demonstrate a particular behavior, the person should be very much positive, he should demonstrate a positive message. He should be able to show that is the what he can do for the organization. He is helpful, he is supportive, he visits to the HR department, talk to the people and ask them that is what is right, what is wrong, where they feel that is there is a need for their attention, and therefore, they will be positive. Then they develop empathy, concern for others. It is also very important part in case of the SQ, spiritual quotients. So, therefore, if you are having this particular type of behavior, developing the empathy, then definitely you can have this very high concern with the others. And when we are talking about the synergy, collaboration, right, or the team building, so all are well connected, but how they are connected? They are connected through empathy. Unless and until there is no empathy, then the employees, they will not show the high concern for each other. So, what is important is, that is in case of this behavior demonstration, the very important part is the demonstrating the empathy, and that is the concern for others. If concern for others is shown, then it will be positive. Now, there are many reasons for which there is a distortion in behavior, and one of the major reasons is stress at workplace. How to minimize the stress? So, stress can be minimized mentally or physically, the stress management is there, and therefore, we know the relationship between the stress and productivity. So, whenever we are talking about the stress and productivity, it goes like this, that is about the inverted use. So, if you want to increase the productivity and there is a stress, so as soon as you will increase the stress, productivity will go high up to a certain extent of the employee's ability. But when you again increase the stress, then in that case you will find that is this particular stress level, it is going productivity is going down as soon as they increase the stress. Now, every individual is having the different diagrams. Some persons are having like this stress, some persons are having like this stress also, and some persons are having the very high stress, bearing the high stress capacity as compared to the productivity is concerned. It means that this relationship between the productivity and stress, it depends from the individual to the individual. And how they mention? They mention with the part of this particular personality. Now, you see, that is, if you are positive, if you are developing the empathy, then in that case you will this positive and empathy will increase the stress bearing capacity. So, in behavior modeling, if you want to teach the management of the stress, then please in behavior show that is how people are positive, and if the people are positive, then the graph of facing the stress, and that will be high. Otherwise, the people will be like this. Suddenly it will go up productivity, but immediately it will go down because they are not able to manage stress. So, what are the ways to manage the stress that can be also we can demonstrate, like how to be positive, how to develop empathy, how to be assertive. Assertiveness in the behavior, that also can be taught, and therefore, in that case the one can learn to be assertive, and the one can also learn to reflect and improve. This is a learning, basically learning for this behavior modeling, and then if you want to make a very powerful personality of yourself, then definitely in that case it will be possible, that is you are talking about the different level of the stress and the reasons for stress, and then relaxing the stress. So, in a given situation one can have a very high stress, but if he is positive and he is developing the empathy, his SQ, spiritual quotient, will be high, which will be minimizing this stress or making the optimization of the stress level. For example, children's admissions or examinations, and that time when we talk about the stress level is very high, but when they learn to be the assertive, then in that case definitely they will be able to be more and more better managers to manage the stress, and then definitely if they are able to manage the stress, that will reflect and improve on their performances. So, if you want to improve their performances, it becomes very, very important, that is the you are with the behavior modeling, you can show that is you are concerned with the empathy with the others, you are positive, and then when you will the trainees will follow the trainer, or when at the workplace, when the young employees, they will follow their senior employees with the positivity and empathy concern, then definitely they will be able to manage stress and learn to be assertive. So, therefore, this is the these are the examples where you can find, that is the how the learners, they can manage their stress and can learn to be assertive and improve their performances. Now, we will talk about, that is the behavior modeling working in the groups. As I mentioned, that is there are different types of personalities, in earlier module I have mentioned. So, some are like a horse, some are like a cat, and some are like an elephant, and therefore, if you keep together in the organization culture, everybody is given different responsibilities, but they are working together in a team, then you can convert this group into team by this behavior modeling. It is a wonderful technology or technique method. It can be used for the developing the team building through the behavior modeling, and the person realize that is, if I do not behave properly, then our team will go down, and if team will go down then and not perform well, then some of them may lose the job also. That is a threat, biggest threat is there. So, what is required? Working in the group and team, and that working in the group and team, that will make a sense, that is the how they are able to accomplish the task. So, if they want to accomplish the task, be positive, develop empathy, understand and manage stress, learn to be assertive, reflect and improve, then in that case definitely they will be able to work in the groups. Now, another important aspect in behavior modeling is that is a negotiation. So, there please read the other exercises and business games, behavior modeling, role playing, and learn to negotiate, how to negotiate. And then therefore, in that case there can be a series of training programs in the negotiation, because as soon as the new generation comes, then they are not able to negotiate it properly. They are more emotional, they are not rational, they are not logical, they are not spiritual, and as a result of which they fell into the negotiation. So, if you want to be a good negotiator, then through behavior modeling you can demonstrate that if you will not behave properly, nobody will agree with your proposal. You will lose the customer base, you will lose your fans club, and therefore, in that case it is very important that is the one individual he learns to negotiate. Then another important point is persuasion, as I mean persuade and influence, and therefore right time, right place, the right person, one should be able to persuade and influence, and that is to be taught with the help of behavior modeling. If proper behavior modeling is there, there will be the negotiation, persuade and influences. Next is the conflict resolution. I have mentioned that is in the conflict resolution, when we talk about the avoidance, accommodation, the 5 strategies do not forget, which I have talked earlier. Then there is a competition, there is a collaboration, and there is a compromise. So, these are the 5 strategies are applicable. Now, if you want to go by these 5 strategies, then in that case what is important is that is you have to understand how to resolve the conflict. And when we are making a script and then the participants they are showing through behavior, that is the how they have compromised, are collaborated, are accommodated, are avoidance is there, or they have the competition is there. So, therefore, that conflict resolution techniques can be learned with the help of behavior modeling. That is, if you are having this type of the conflict, negotiate, talk to each other in this way, because you have to adopt a particular strategy, adopt that strategy not by the strategy you want to demonstrate, no, what is required, what is important, what is to be shown, and therefore, that conflict resolution and mediation strategy that will work, and then they will demonstrate how effective you are. And finally, in the behavior modeling is problem solving and decision making. You can go for the this particular type of the exercises where the behavior modeling is done and the problem is solved. So, how a superior should behave with the subordinate, then superior has asked to okay, let us play, and then he has been given a role of the subordinate, and then same dialogues are repeated by the another senior. Then in that case, then he will realize how I was behaving with this particular employee. So, therefore, in that case, in a given situation, for the problem solving and decision making and appropriate behavior that can be also demonstrated with the help of behavior modeling. These are the certain examples basically which give you an idea, that is the how one can go for this particular type of the training programs and can create the better training base, and if they are able to do behavior properly, behavior modeling properly, message will be fast and quick. So, when I say, if I say it, the other person will understand. If I say it, the other person will understand what it means. Not necessarily meaning is ascribed by the receiver of a message. So, wearing it does not mean it will be understood. We need to check to see if the meaning of our message is understood and intended or not. So, therefore, just by saying, if I say and then the other person will understand, it is not enough. Sometimes we may get the losses, sometimes we may get the misunderstanding, and therefore, it becomes very important, that is that we have to check if the meaning is meaning of our message is understood properly as we have intended to do. And if we are not having that proper message, then definitely believe me, then there will be the miscommunication and the other person will not understand, which may increase to employees turnover also. Now, whenever we are talking about the next part, that is the more communication the better is. What it means? If you are feeling misunderstood, as I mentioned in the earlier slide, that is if I say it, that the person will understand. No, you have to check if the meaning is properly understood or not, and if the more communication the better is. It is not necessarily. If you are feeling misunderstood, talking too much and louder is a mistake. So, many times employees feel that is then when they will talk more, they will create more network. Not necessarily. It is possible that is talking too much and louder is a mistake. This can actually exacerbate a situation where versus clarify it. So, therefore, it is important that whenever this type of the situation arises in communication, we have to clarify. Excessive talking would not help. Please understand, that is the many people feel that is they will talk too much, then they will develop the better interpersonal relationship. Not necessarily. It may lead to the misunderstanding, and therefore, excessive talking never helps. That try different ways of expressing yourself. So, not necessarily that you are verbally you are talking and expressing yourself. Sometimes by showing your concern and the message is gone. Knowing when to remain silent is a part of communication effectively. So, many times we have to be very careful that whenever we are talking about this particular message, and then sometimes without talking, without communicating, without expressing yourself, that is it is better to remain silent, because that will make the message more effectively. So, if you communicate and then you say that is the message will go, not necessarily. So, sometimes this non-verbal that will help. Any problem can be solved at any time if we communicate with each other. There are times when taking some times away from each other and the situation can be a better solution than trying to talk it out. Often high intensity emotions such as anger or sadness can be low and interaction among the proportion, out of proportion, and a few moments of self reflection and calm can help you again perceptiveness on the issue. So, it is a question, that is what type of the demonstration is there. In the case there is an interaction is out of proportion, then definitely it will harm. It is not going to help anybody. So, what is required? A few moments of self reflection, understand that whatever we are talking, it is right or wrong, and then the calm can help. So, if you are calm, cool and collective, as I always mention, then that can help you gaining the perspective on this particular issue, and as a result of which the persons will be able to be successful. Next is communication is a natural ability. Some have it and some do not. It is not an innate ability. Skillful communication can be learned with the practice. So, it is not necessary that if somebody is having the naturally better communication, only in that case he can also have a better communication at workplace, otherwise he will not. No, not necessary, he can learn. The communication is a practice which one can learn. There are some very simple tips that can dramatically increase how you understand others and are understood. Try them out and see for yourself if anything changes, and therefore sometimes it works, sometimes it does not work. So, one magic will not be fit for all. So, please see, that is the how dramatically by behavior modeling you can find out and understand, that is how the things will work here or which things will not work here. Now, I would like to show a demonstration of the sensitivity training in the classroom, and then you will find that another aspect of the behavior modeling is, that is the how to be more and more sensitive and then making the more effective the communication. So, it is not necessarily that in the behavior modeling you have to write a script and then, but also we can see the by providing the sensitivity training. Let them understand each other, be sensitive, and then they will be having the successful learning of the behavior modeling. I would like to show here with this video.
भाई चले बाहर.
Hi Rupesh, welcome to the new team. So where are you from?
सर मैं बरनाला से
बरनाला. यार मेरा पिछला इंटर्न वहीं से था, बिल्कुल काम नहीं करता था, बहुत काम चोर था.
तो वही सवाल ना. अरे यार सही में यार दिमाग खराब कर रखा था उस बंदे ने.
Hi Rupesh, welcome to the new team. So where are you from?
सर मैं बरनाला से.
Oh, Barnala, nice. We have a team member who's also from Barnala.
Hello.
Rupesh. Oh, so let's continue with the meeting.
Okay.
Sure.
So let's start on with the meeting. Where is the fourth member?
Ayush has to come and he did not inform us, so let's proceed with the meeting.
Okay, so let's go on. So we should be discussing more this project.
Yeah, so.
Hey guys, what's up?
Fine, and we have begun the meeting.
So as you can see all these things happening.
Hi, nice to meet you. Nice to meet you.
Hi, Annie. Hi.
Hello.
Now, whenever we are talking about the appropriate dressing, then in that case you will find that is the always people are very much sensitive about this type of this training, and it is making the people understand about themselves and others reasonably. So, there whenever you are going into a formal environment, and then definitely in that case the formal dressing, that will make you the sensitive. However, some leading organizations, they are they may not give that much emphasis, because the culture which they are developing, that is more informal and but can be more creative also. So, may not be applicable to all, but in general whenever we are talking about the dressing sense, and that makes a difference. In them the social sensitivity and behavioral flexibility, this is very interesting point, that is the, as I always mention about the flexibility, and here the flexibility is the behavioral flexibility, how you can show the behavioral flexibility, and if there is a flexibility in the behavior, then definitely the person that can be adjusted at any workplace. But the personalities which are rigid and then they are not flexible enough, then they will not be able to cope up with the given situation, and especially the stressful situations. For the stressful situations, it is very important that is you are having the behavioral flexibility, because unless and until you will not understand others, you will not get understood. If you do not give this opportunity, then how one will be able to learn? And if you will not able to learn and understand each other, how your managerial effectiveness will increase? So, sensitivity training is giving an opportunity to understand others. Sensitivity training is giving an opportunity to work with others. It is also giving an opportunity to learn from others. But all these aspects, what is the first and foremost condition is, and that is about the behavioral flexibility. I am sure that is the those who are having this behavioral flexibility, their social and social sensitivity is high, they will be more and more liked by the people, and then they will be getting the better teamwork and better leadership also. So, social sensitivity is one word is empathy, as I mentioned in the earlier also, that is about the concern for others. If you have the concern for others, and then only you will be able to develop that sensitivity training. It is ability of an individual to sense what others feel. Others may not speak, others may not tell, others may not express their problems, but what is important? If you are enough sensitive at your workplace, you will understand the problems of others. You will understand if somebody is down in the mood, and if somebody is low in the swing, then in that case it will be very important, that is if you are socially sensitive, you can read, you can understand, and you can take the action and make the person they are more happy and in a better situation. So, therefore, the social sensitivity, that is this is the, whenever we are talking about the empathy, and that what others feel without saying and think from their own point of view. Many times in the meeting you will find that there are the proposals, and these proposals are not accepted, and the persons they are getting upset. So, therefore, if this is the situation, what is required? Even the leader finds that this proposal is not viable, not practical, not supporting to the organization, what he is supposed to do? He has to discuss and give the reasons, that is why this proposal is not acceptable. But just rejecting without concern about the others' feelings, right, and then saying no, this will not work, and no reason for that, then definitely people will hurt, and if the people will hurt, then definitely the performance will go down, and then we will be failing in the social sensitivity. What is the behavior flexibility? Is ability to behave suitably in the light of understanding. Wonderful point is there, and therefore, in that case, if the person, if he is able to make the others understanding and then tune up, modify his behavior suitably in the light of the understanding, then definitely in that case the person is master of sensitivity training. So, goals of sensitivity training, I was talking about that in this sensitivity training, that behavioral flexibility is there to increase the understanding, insight and self awareness about one's own behavior, and therefore, this becomes very important. First we learn our own behavior, and then to increase the understanding and sensitivity about the behavior of others. So, this behavior of others will making the good team building. You learn to know yourself and you learn to know others, and then when this type of the learning is there, so behavioral flexibility will be adopted. So, better understanding and awareness of group and intergroup processes in the organization. There are different sockets are there, and in those sockets if somebody is working, then definitely they will be able to come out with the more and more cohesiveness, understanding each other and develop each others. To increase ability to transform learning into action, and then they will develop those actions, and to improve individuals ability to analyze their own interpersonal behavior, and then day by day with the experience one will be able to develop himself. So, at the end what I would like to say, that is behavior modeling is not a lecture, it is a technique and method. By just demonstration people can develop and improve themselves, develop interpersonal relationship, behavioral flexibility, sensitivity training will be, they will be sensitized, as a result of which the different class of the departments, they will work together, there will be the more and more interaction, better understanding, and ultimately organization will be benefited. Trainees will learn through the behavior modeling practices what behavior change is required, when they will understand themselves, they will understand their weaknesses, and they will convert their weakness, removing by their weaknesses personality is a strong personality. So, this is our heart about the behavior modeling. Thank you.